Welcome to Raising the Bar, Lessons Learned in Online Teaching Edition, a one-hour webinar featuring faculty from the University of Delaware's School of Education's fully online program in teacher leadership. Dr. Rachel Karchmer-Klein is Associate Professor of Literacy Education and author of the recently published 2020 book, Improving Online Teacher Education, Digital Tools and Evidence-Based Practices, available from Teachers College Press. Dr. Elizabeth Soslow is Associate Professor of Teacher Education and author of the forthcoming book, A Practical Guide to Field Instruction, also to be published by Teachers College Press. We also welcome Dr. Bill Lewis, Associate Professor of Literacy Education and author of Cracking the Common Code, published by Guilford. Last but not least, our moderator today is Dr. Matthew Trevitt-Smith, Director of UD's Center for Teaching and Assessment of Learning. I am Steve Dandino, Associate Provost at Colorado State University and Executive Director of the Reinvention Collaborative. On behalf of the RC's Research University members, I want to thank our presenters, Go Blue Hens, and invite Dr. Trevitt-Smith to moderate henceforth. Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I'll say hello while I believe Rachel's going to throw up a slideshow for us. So the main context of today is to talk about our three main questions. And those three main questions that we're going to be discussing, and the format here really is going to be conversational, which is why I also want to give a shout out to my colleague Stacy Larkin from UD's Center for Teaching and Assessment of Learning, who's going to be helping me moderate the question and answer feature as well as the chat box. So the idea here is that while our panelists are talking, that you go ahead and a question comes to mind, we don't want you to forget it. Quick, write it down in the Q&A box, right? And then we can always come to it when it comes to that particular portion of the conversation, or a little bit later towards the end when we're in the more formal Q&A time. You're also welcome to use the chat feature. And so our hope is that between Stacy and I, we'll be able to keep an eye on some of the questions and comments that are coming up in either of those two formats. So I appreciate that. Again, this is going to be pitched as a fireside chat, so more conversational than presentational, although we do have some slides that will help us reinforce the conversation as we go along. And those three main talking points that we'd like to discuss here with you today are: how do we continue to implement sound instructional practices, right? Particularly important as we're making this transition from emergency remote to fully more thoughtful, high quality online delivery. The second is, how should we approach field experiences? This is something that's particularly relevant to folks in this field. And lastly, we'll try and bring all of this together with the question of what advice does our panelists have about creating an integrated programmatic online experience. They'll also be shared a web page that has various resources that our panel is going to be discussing today, and some glorious bios and headshots are also featured on there, which I'm particularly excited. We all have high def images up there. So we're welcome to do that. And the last thing I want to say before we get into the next slide is that it's our particular hope that the conversation that we have here today is going to be one that you're really going to have no other choice but to share with everybody that you know who's making this transition from emergency remote to fully online instruction. Because the concepts that we're going to be discussing here today and our panelists are going to be highlighting are particular to the field of education, but are also implementable, if that's the right word, across disciplines, right? So this is really going to be a Zoom recording to share and tweet about and upvote on LinkedIn and all those other things that you do. So we're setting the bar pretty high here. So with that, I'll briefly introduce myself. The panelists will introduce themselves, and then we'll get to the conversation. So as Steve introduced, my name is Matt Trevitt-Smith. I'm Director for the Center for Teaching and Assessment of Learning here at the University of Delaware. What's unique about our center is that, yes, we're a faculty development driven center, but we're also the center of assessment of learning. So we partner with programs for their program level educational goals, to create those, to assess those, to refine those, and to facilitate conversation around those. And we also have a hand to play in the assessment of our more general education or more university-wide programs as well. So really thrilled to be here today and thank my colleagues from UD for the opportunity. So I'm going to give Rachel a chance to introduce herself, and then we're going to move down the line.
Hey, hi, I'm really excited to be here too, and to have this invitation sent to us to talk about something that we're incredibly proud of. And it was fun seeing people enter this webinar because some of the names are familiar, so welcome. For those of you who are familiar with our programs, and to those of you also who are not. Hopefully you'll draw some really important lessons that we have experienced. So a little bit about myself. I've been at Delaware. I just finished my 17th year. I was at VCU in Richmond, Virginia for 4 years before that. And when I was at VCU, I had the opportunity to teach my first fully online course. And that was an eye-opening experience for me. And that was at the time before we were using dial-up, and we were using a chat box to communicate. So if you look back, 18 years when I was teaching that actual class, or 17 and a half years, and now we look at the technology that we're using today, we really have come quite far. I did just write a book, Improving Online Teacher Education. I started this book when I started that first class that I was figuring out how to teach in 2003, and then all of this kind of came to fruition, and it just so happened that the book was published in April. Not that it happens to be extremely timely given the experience that we're in. So I'm glad to be able to share the ideas that I have in that book and with all of you today. So now I'm going to throw it over to my colleague, Bill.
Hi, everybody. My name is Bill Lewis. I'm very excited to be here to talk a little bit about our experiences in the MED and Teacher Leadership Program. I'm an associate professor in the School of Education. I'm just finishing up my 13th year at the University of Delaware. Before that time, I spent 20 years teaching English language arts in Pennsylvania public schools. Most of my work at the university is with undergraduate students who are training to be either English language arts teachers or history teachers. And I also teach graduate courses in disciplinary literacy and in curriculum and instruction. A lot of my own work is really based on helping teachers to be able to develop literacy skills in their adolescent students. And so I have been, I'm one of the authors of Cracking the Common Core, which is about choosing and using texts in grades 6 through 12. And I have a new book coming out on literacy instruction with a former doc student at the University of Delaware and former colleague, colleague John Strong, who teaches at the University of Buffalo. Excited to be here and can't wait to talk a little bit about our experiences.
Hi everyone, I'm also very excited to be here. My name is Elizabeth Soslow and I'm an associate professor in the School of Education. I've been there for over a decade. The main part of my clinical practice is focused on working with teacher candidates during student teaching. So I go out, I observe and teach, and then we collaborate around debriefing sessions based on their teaching practice. I have a book coming out that I'm very excited for. It's a practical field guide to instruction that will be published by Teachers College Press, and it's based on a decade's worth of research that has been previously published in outlets like Journal Teacher Education, Teaching and Teacher Education, and some others. So I'm really excited to be here. And I do want to just say that as a co-founder of the fully online master's program with Rachel and Bill, I hope that we do have some insights that you will find useful for your own practice.
Thank you all. And as Elizabeth mentioned, I did want to give a shout out to that online program, which has been ranked number 15 best online education program by US News and World Report. So a kudos to my colleagues for all the great things that they're doing in their program. Real quick, I've mentioned this twice and the third time's the charm. Really what we want to focus on is that the difference, the experiences that we all had in this, what our colleagues are calling emergency remote teaching, right? We really do want to make a distinction between what we all had to do in the spring and what we want to do in the fall, right? We don't want to continue with the genre of emergency remote teaching into the fall. We really want to be able to have some thoughtful discussion and some thoughtful planning around ways that we want to engage learners, what our outcomes are, how we might have to revisit those, particularly around experiences such as field work, right, which is very, very relevant to this particular field. How do we do that in a mode of online instruction, right? So this is really the key point here. I'm not going to read the slide, so just the idea is the summary behind what we're doing. And I hope everybody here has their coffee, has cuddled up to a fire or a mist fan, however the weather finds you, wherever you are. For me, it would be a mist fan or a ceiling fan. And this is the informal conversation point here. And again, I urge you, as you have questions, please use the Q&A tool or go ahead and put those in the chat boxes. So Rachel, you're going to kick us off. How do we continue to implement sound instructional practices when we're teaching online?
Okay. Well, thank you. What a great question, and one that I have been thinking about for many, many years. And again, I just want to say I am actually really glad that online instruction has now become a priority. I'm not glad why it has become a priority, but I am glad that we're thinking differently about it and how we can leverage digital tools to really not only teach our students, but prepare teachers to then go out and teach their own students how to use digital tools. So one of the things that I always think about when people ask me about how to teach online is I think about our current environment, and I think about what happened in the spring and what we're doing to prepare for the fall. And one of the things, I'm going to generalize here, but I sort of feel like with all of the chaos of what happened, that really many of us forgot what best practices in teaching are, right? We are pedagogical experts if we were teaching in a school of education, or we should be pedagogical experts, right? And so with that said, one of the things that I do, I'm teaching a course right now on online instructional design, and I had my students who are university instructors, supervisors of curriculum and instruction, K-12 teachers in public schools and private schools. I asked them to, before we do anything, to sit back and think about, what do you know about best practices? And the way that I define best practices are related to evidence-based practices in which we have research that supports what we're doing when we are delivering content to students, and we are identifying what those learning objectives are that we want them to meet, and how those strategies that we're using to have students absorb that content and learn that content and then be able to apply that content. And so I find it really helpful to go back and think about what we know about teaching, and then think about what or how we would leverage digital tools to then be able to not replicate what we do in a face-to-face classroom, but how we can use digital tools to now engage students in similar practices within online environments. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in relation to 3 big ideas. My book goes into this in a lot more depth, but I find that these 3 areas are really important that I want to share with you. So the first big idea is to prioritize instructional design by focusing on your learning objectives. And so what I mean by that is if we talk about what I just said about the spring and kind of forgetting what we know about teaching, there was a lot of focus on digital tools. If you were in K-12 or if you were at the university level, no doubt you were getting email after email from software companies saying, take our digital tool for free for the next 30 days because we know you're in this situation right now. There was a lot of concentration and focus on digital tools. Probably one of the most used tools was Zoom, which we're on right now. And what ended up happening was there was a lot of direct instruction that was taking place over Zoom. So instead, what I recommend is that we take a look at what our learning objectives are. We consider the students that we are teaching and what pedagogical decision-making should come into play when thinking about our instruction. And we want to think about how students can demonstrate their learning. We want them to identify then evidence-based practices that will achieve that goal of the learning, right? Once we have identified those things, then we can choose a tool. I tell people all of the time, there are plenty of tools out there, and there are plenty of free tools out there, and there are lots of tools that will embed directly into your LMSs. So you should not be wedded to a specific tool when you're creating an activity, because I can tell you for every one, whiteboard tool that you want to use, I could probably find another 50. So the first thing you need to do is really to focus on what it is that you want to teach students and how you can get to that point. The second key point that I want to sort of hit home here is the thought of reflecting cognitive, social, and situated learning perspectives into your instructional design choices. These learning perspectives really help me when I'm thinking and when I'm trying to match up my evidence-based practices to my instructional design. And what do I mean by that? Well, I want students to engage in cognitive tasks. I want them to use mental processes, and I want them to demonstrate their own independent individual thinking by connecting new ideas, for example, to existing understandings. One way of doing that is through a think aloud. There's a large research base related to think alouds and verbal protocols, students talking out loud. We use that as teachers ourselves in modeling how we want students to think and learn different strategies. Well, this is very easily done in a digital environment by digitizing a think aloud, by using a screencast, for example. Social tasks are also really important because we know that good teaching should require at some level either or collaboration or interactivity, or even a combination of both of these. And I make a distinction here. Collaboration is when we're working together towards the same goal. Interactivity, where we may work independently on whatever projects that we're working on, but the interactivity comes to play when we start talking about, debating, critically thinking and providing constructive criticism towards others in a respectful tone about whatever it is that we're working on. So one example of doing this is peer review. Again, we have a large research base for that. Finally, situated learning tasks. Elizabeth's going to talk more about field experience, but situated learning tasks taps into that, right? Requiring application of our skills into different authentic contexts. One way that we do this many times is case-based instruction. We do this a lot. If we have field experiences, students are out in the schools, Elizabeth will talk about this, they come back, they report. Well, how can we provide case-based instruction opportunities to our students in a digital environment? My third key point and big idea that I'd like to highlight here is about intentionally leveraging attributes of digital text. And this big idea, in my opinion, really gets pushed to the side way too much. If we're going to use digital text, we have to understand what digital texts encompass. What are their attributes? How do we use them? How do we consume the information they're sharing with us? And how do we produce digital text as well? Attributes of digital text include multimodality. They are malleable, meaning that we can change them very easily. They're nonlinear. Well, if you just think about how in schools of education, we teach kids how to read and write, we teach them to read and write from left to right, top to bottom, using written language. Sometimes with pictures, images as well, right? We'll talk about. But for the most part, we put the cognitive load on written language. Well, once we have multimodality and we have a nonlinearity related to how we're engaging and navigating digital text, all of this is thrown out the window, and we have to be sure that we understand the tools that we're using and how we are, in fact, sharing the content with our students. Digital texts also allow for interactivity, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. So what does all of this mean? Many times I have worked with a lot of faculty, and this tends to be, and I've spoken to a lot of students, And this tends to be the sort of framework that many faculty sort of gravitate towards when they're designing online instruction. And this happened a lot in the spring. And again, I'm not being critical of people in the spring. This was like last minute. I totally get it. But, you know, reading a chapter, watching, you know, a talking head of an instructor for 45 minutes or an hour, completing a quiz, and then posting a response, those are okay activities. However, that's not what I consider to be interactive, collaborative, or engaging online instruction. I use, for myself, in all of my planning, I work from the view of what's known as the pedagogy of multiliteracies. I'm not going to get too much into that now. I talk about it in my book, but I use, as a framework for my instructional design, Cope and Clance's work related to the 4 knowledge processes. One knowledge process is experience. That's when you introduce new ideas or you revisit prior knowledge. Conceptualizing content. That's when we make those mental models, that cognitive perspective that we had talked about. Analysis, when we think critically about content or experiences. And then application, right? Transferring to and utilization of knowledge in real world contexts. And I'm going to provide you with an example of this. Of these. But first, what I want to tell you from my experience and my research, these 4 knowledge processes are not separate and they're not sequential. And I also always tell faculty that I work with not to spend way too much time worrying, is this kind of conceptualizing or analyzing? That's really not the point. The point is, think about these types of activities and how you can engage your students in multiple opportunities to engage with content in these different ways, right? A lot of times, I have learned in my own research with middle school students in one-to-one environments that most instruction typically starts with experiencing. Can't say that's too surprising, right? For us as teacher educators, that we want to introduce a new idea, we want them to tap into their background knowledge. However, from there, what we want to look at are how these series of activities are woven together. And I use the term that others have used, which is an instructional chain. You can create an instructional chain either with all digital activities, which is also known as app smashing, or a combination of digital and non-digital activities. So let me just give you quick examples. This is taken from a 7th grade, and I kind of went back and forth. My book has lots of examples of how to do this in teacher education with teacher education students, with adults. But since this was an education audience, I shared these examples from 7th grade classroom. So this is an example of an all digital instructional chain. Okay, so it's in science class, we experience, and remember, an instructional chain is just a portion of an entire unit. So there are things that came before this and there are things that are possibly coming after it. But so we would begin by experiencing, for example, the circulatory system, and we would use a virtual heart app, which would allow students to manipulate the beating of a heart to see blood flow and really get a sense of what the system does within the human body. An activity in which they would conceptualize, they could then compare the circulatory system with what they know about the digestive system, and they could use an interactive whiteboard app in which they could create a Venn diagram, some other sort of compare and contrast. They could be working with other students as well, whether it be in the classroom or they could be doing this from home. And they could all, sort of like a Google Doc, they could be on the app at the same time. Then we have application. Students could create a digital presentation using the Show Me app, if you're familiar with that. It's an interactive whiteboard as well that allows audio and video and images. And you could use that app to describe the functions of the 2 body systems. You're applying now your knowledge and what you learned when you did that, that compare and contrast. And then we step back one further, or we step forward one further, and we have students analyze what they've done. They took a look at their classmates' work. Given what we've learned about the systems, you could provide students with a rubric to think about, all right, so now what I want you to do is provide feedback given what we know using a password-protected app. So this is an example of an all digital lesson that I've actually observed in a classroom, a 7th grade classroom. You can also have digital and non-digital, and I have learned in my research that this tends to be easier for some teachers to design because you're not overly reliant on technology. And also, we don't want to assume just because our students have become much more adept at using technology that it's easy for them to app smash or move in between different technologies at the same time. So you can read through this, but you would see that you would start off, this is in the social studies class, conducting an internet search on a presidential candidate's positions. They could then conceptualize comparing and contrast candidate statements on one issue, and they could use paper pencil for that. So that's non-digital. They could then analyze position statements from the candidates, and they would identify their own beliefs about the issues. Again, not using technology. However, their application and what they're presenting to you for their knowledge could be done through video depicting their position, and perhaps even moving on to debating how other people are viewing content. So these are just examples of how I think about all of my lessons, and I do this at the beginning of when I'm going through the planning phase for every single lesson that I do each week. So what I'd like to do is bring in some of my colleagues here. One of the areas related, obviously, to instructional design also is getting to know your students and community building. So I'm going to throw this over to Bill and ask him to talk a little bit about that.
Hey, thanks, Rachel, and thanks, everybody. So, one of the things that I always tell my my pre-service teachers is that teaching is at heart relational, not procedural. And so, I really take that to heart. And so building communities of learners is a very important part of the things that I try to do in my face-to-face instruction, and also that I try to do in my online instruction. And in many cases, I think that when we have to actually be more strategic in our online instruction is the way that we build those particular relationships. So how do we do that in an online instruction? So, I always, when I left the high school, and my high school colleagues used to ask me, what's the difference between teaching in high school and teaching in college? And I said, well, the thing that happens is when you're teaching in college or teaching in high school, students are always right there. And that is actually really different when we're dealing with adults and also adult learners in college situations. We sometimes, even in face-to-face, we only see them 2 times a week, or we see them 1 time a week in the part of many of our graduate students. And as we have shifted to online instruction this past spring, we see them even less. And so making those kinds of strategic choices, I think, are really important. They help our students to feel supported. And actually, many of the things that we do are very important for making the course easier for both our students, or at least more accessible, and also easier and more accessible for ourselves as instructors. So one of the ways that I try to build that instruction, that we try to do this in the MED and leadership program, is by first of all making sure that we can actually reach out to our students well before the course even begins. So in the MED and teacher leadership, we have committed to basically having our whole course up and online at one time, so that students can truly work at that at their own pace. However, one of the things that we want to do is that we want to make sure that we're going to be able to welcome students into that, to make sure that all students have access to the course, they have access to the technology tools that they need. And so making sure that we're able to reach out to students well before the semester begins is an important part of making them feel a valued part of the community, and also somebody who can actually really access the course and be successful in that course. So you see here as in a message, where the first part of the community building is a message I sent out to my literacy in the discipline course that I taught last fall. This is where I introduce myself, make sure that students have access to the technology tools, and then also make sure that they are able to reach out to me if they don't have access or need any other help. So that's the first step that we really do that, by making that initial contact with students and making sure that they understand that they are supported. Sorry about that. My cat has leaped up on my desk and is now trying to close my laptop on me. Okay, so the next thing that I think that we need to be strategic about is some things that Rachel talked about. We actually have adopted a method of doing Monday morning messages, which is to let students know exactly what's going to be happening in the module that they're going to be seeing that week, and give them a little bit of a conceptual understanding of what they're going to be seeing and a framework for understanding what's going on. Right? Like, excuse me, I'm going to just grab my cat here. Oh, sorry. So I'm glad that that made it onto the video. That's going to be fantastic. But I think that one of the things that we want to do is that we want to link to prior learning, make sure that we're preparing them for what they're going to be looking at. And also, you know, this gives us a great time to add some reminders about what we want to be seeing in their course assessments or in some of the work that they're going to be doing that week. We do this right at the beginning of every week. It's a very important part of the community building, and it actually does make our students feel valued and connected to us as learners in this class. So one of the other things that I ended up doing for my undergraduate class in particular this spring was to actually take that Monday morning message and be able to put it on video. So I have a video excerpt that I'd like you to take a look at. This is for undergraduate English language arts teachers. And one of the things that I want to do is not only preview the kinds of things that they're going to be seeing in that module and to be able to remind them about or be able to provide them a conceptual framework for what's going to be going on, but it also is a way to really seek out the relationship building by sharing a part of myself. You'll see as you look at the video on the bottom corner that I have my COVID-19 hair well in shape here. So Rachel, if you could play that, that'd be great. Rachel, I'm not exactly. I'm not hearing the video, the sound on that. It might be because you have your earphones in. Hey everybody, this is the Monday morning message for week 8, EDUC ENGL 403. So first of all, I hope that you are all still well, that you and your families are hanging in there during this pandemic time. So I've been feeling really good. Everybody in my family is well, and it's been great having the messages from you this week, and also getting a chance to talk with some of you during office hours. So I encourage you to attend office hours if you'd want to catch up, and especially if you're having some questions about some things that are moving forward. So let's catch up, shall we? So first of all, I've been doing some fishing. So I fished a little bit yesterday, caught a rainbow trout, and there's me with my fishing hat. And you can tell that it is a fishing hat because it has a fish on it, which makes it a lot less confusing for me. Also been doing a little bit of gardening. There's some of our square foot gardens. I have some lettuce and some spinach, and I've also planted beet seeds and radish seeds. I've of course been reorganizing my voluminous Insane Clown Posse CD collection, and I will have you know that I have joined the Amethyst League in Duolingo Spanish. So doing pretty good there. So vamos mis alumnos, es la semana 8. Let's move on. So first of all, I'm really looking forward to reading your discussions about heart and body in the world, and also genderqueer. These are really, I think, very, very important books, dealing a lot with identity and trauma, and I think these are really important books for young adults to engage with. I am actually going to be probably giving you audio comments, long rambling audio comments. Hey Rachel, you can actually stop that there. So although this is this is a class that I had developed a really good relationship with. We had a class last time. I felt that one of the things that was needed, especially during this time of crisis, was to actually have that kind of personal contact. Although I could not be face-to-face with my students, I had to be sure that I can make some contact with them. And one of the ways that I was able to do that was by constructing some of the video Monday morning messages, which provided them not only an update on some of the things that I've been doing that I can share with them, but also be able to highlight some of the things that they're going to be seeing, and then also focusing on some of the key assessments that they would be would be working through. So Rachel, if you can just move to the next part, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that, that are an important part of the community building. So one of those things that we need to be thinking about is that I want students to be able to engage with each other. And one of the ways that we do this is by setting up very specific and very structured discussions where students are able to work in groups where they read some material, whether that be online, digital, or whether that be something that we provide for them, and that they then engage in some important discussions. One of the things that we really want to do is then make sure that students are going to be able to talk with each other. You know, collaboration works in education, and providing those opportunities for students to be able to collaborate, to respond to one another, is an important part of the things that we do online. If you take a look at that video is 10 minutes long, but I don't do any really long lectures. I want students to be able to gain that content knowledge, that disciplinary knowledge, through their engagement with the kinds of specifically chosen texts that I have, and by collaboration and engagement with each other. So in order to do this, one of the ways that we really need to be, if we're going to be valuing collaboration, then we have to be able to teach students the expectations of what we're looking for in those collaborations. So Rachel, if you go to the next slide, that'd be awesome. So this peer response unit or rubric is one of the ways that I encourage my students to not only engage with the material by synthesizing the readings and course materials into their discussion posts, and then also bringing their own experiences as a student, their own lived experiences of both the student and as a professional into those discussions. I also want to be able to give them very clear guidance on what they should be doing in their peer responses. I'm sure that you've probably been engaged in some online discussions where a lot of times students just say, "Oh, that's an awesome opinion!" ! But with no real synthesis of the ideas that we're going over in that particular module, or no other particular extensions or questions about what their peer has actually provided in their own discussion posts. So thinking through really clearly about making sure that we're encouraging them to both synthesize their readings and their personal and professional connections, but also then giving them clear guidance on how they're responding to peers actually makes those a much more rich experience.
I want to bring in a question from the chat, as well as a question that it's come through as well. And that is, as instructors are being assigned or being encouraged to teach online synchronously or asynchronously, are any of the frameworks or techniques you're really talking about the importance of engaging the content, as well as collaborating with you as the instructors and their co-learners? Is that possible to do? It's probably a pretty quick answer, but to put some fears at rest, is that possible to do in various modalities of online instruction?
Absolutely. So I teach most of my classes completely asynchronously. And so, I mean, there's benefits to having students have the opportunity to be able to ingest content, really absorb it, think about it, and before they're providing peer feedback, for example, really be able to think about and articulate what they want to say. I have also taught I've also taught synchronously. One of using these, what I tend to do is I like I'm going to say hybrid in terms of it's fully online, but it's asynchronous and synchronous. I'm not talking about face-to-face. And one of my recommendations that I've been giving quite a bit since, especially during this time, to faculty at universities, but then also K-12, is you think about, all right, I have an hour and 15 minutes scheduled for my course. What do I do? Does it need to all be synchronous? Does it need to be asynchronous? How do I do that? My recommendation is, this is what I would do. I would probably have everybody meet, do some direct instruction or something for the first 20, 25 minutes. We're talking about adults here as opposed to kindergartners and first graders. So I probably let them go and assume that if I put on a timer and they put on a timer, they'll come back 20 minutes later after perhaps they're engaging in a text or a video or some other kind of activity. When we come back, they can go into a Zoom or a Canvas conference room and they can have a conversation related to the prompting. And then they could have follow-up, whether it be something after my time frame is done. So discussion boards or working on other types of activities. So absolutely, I think that all of these activities can be done either in real time or asynchronously, but I have to say you have to be really careful. App smashing is really tough. So if we're on Zoom and you're asking students to also be doing like 10 other things on other technology tools, that can be really tough. And sometimes, it's about weighing the benefit and what exactly it is that you want to engage the students in to meet your learning goal.
Thanks. I think that will put a lot of fears at ease as folks are thinking about whether they're teaching synchronously, asynchronously, some mix thereof, or they're not quite sure yet what their university is going to do, that it is still possible. Elizabeth, this next question's for you to get us started, and this is something that's relevant obviously in education, but also in other social sciences, humanities, in the sciences. How do we think about online field experiences within your particular context?
Thanks, Matt. So first I want to go over some kind of givens and a premise, and then I'll share 2 examples. So first, we know that even if school buildings open, they may not be open to our candidates. They may just be open to pupils. And or if they're open to candidates, they may not be open to faculty to go in and observe candidates and discuss teaching with candidates. We also know that there's probably going to be some version of online learning for pupils, right? And this also brings us to thinking about media releases for the pupils. So many of us teaching programs that have performance assessments. So we have media releases for the pupils anyway, for things like the EdTPA or the PPAT or whatever. But do we have media releases that say you can share images of my student with faculty back on campus who may then use those for instructional purposes? So something to think about there. In the context of these conditions, we know that candidates are going to have to film their practice and share those videos with you. So I'm going to share 2 examples of what I did this spring with my student teachers during student teaching. And the examples are based on this premise that high quality field instruction rests on the assumption that it's the conversation and the debriefing with the candidate that's the learning opportunity for the candidate. It's not sitting in a seat or behind a video screen watching someone and then typing in feedback, because there's a lot of invisible thinking going on inside the candidate's head. And if we don't work to unmask that invisible thinking, learn about the rationales and justifications for their instructional components and practices, we can't really help them then interrogate and assess their decision making. So that's the premise of these 2 examples. So the 2 examples, as I said, they're real examples from COVID-19 spring semester. And one requires some video editing skills, both on the part of the candidate as well as the part of the field instructor. And I should clarify, I'm using the term field instructor. Some people call them supervisors, or some folks have clinical faculty or temporary adjunct faculty. So if this doesn't apply directly to you, perhaps it's something you can share with folks who do this work in the field. So the first example, go ahead, Rach. The first example is one that's recorded without live pupils. So this student, her name is Charity Merrill. She's a brilliant candidate that I had the pleasure of working with, and she gave me her express permission to share her work with you all today. She recorded herself conducting a read aloud, and she included some instructional pauses, and you can see an example of an instructional pause here. So kind of like if you ever saw Dora the Explorer and she stops and asks people a question and then she pauses and the kids scream back at the TV, that kind of idea. And she shared this read aloud publicly with anybody who wanted to see it, but she also sent it strategically to pupils she knew who would watch the video and also videotape themselves and send it back to her so she could see authentic reactions from pupils. She ended her video by inviting viewers, child viewers, to share their exit tickets or work with her so that she could then use the pupil work to go back and interrogate the value of what she did in the actual instructional event, right? So were the students producing the types of evidence of learning that she was hoping to elicit with her instructional decision-making throughout. I sent her a reflection form, which I'll share with you in a little bit. And we published a paper about this reflection form in addition to the debriefing protocol. So there's 2 separate papers I can link you up to if you want more information or details. And so I sent her a reflection form, she filled it out, and then we set up a time to Zoom to debrief the lesson. For permission settings, you might notice that's me and my son in the corner of the screen. So I actually had my son watch her video. We recorded ourselves with him reacting, and then he sent his pupil work, and she used that as evidence to then interrogate her lesson. So if you'll see on the next slide, this was her second read aloud. So she actually, the idea here is that she applies the co-constructed revisions to her lesson into her next read aloud. Otherwise, what was the point of talking to her about feedback, right? So here she includes additional stopping points. She uses additional strategies around predicting and inferencing and clarifying unfamiliar vocabulary. She does some text to self connections, asking child viewers to talk about ways in which they connect with the text. And then again, we followed exactly the same cycle. We videotaped ourselves. We sent the videotape to Charity. She then used that evidence to reflect on the value of her instructional decision making. So again, just as a caveat, it did require some video editing skills on my part and Charity's part, but after the first run around, we were able to knock out a lot of technical issues that made it a lot easier the second time around. So the next example, for those of us that don't want to edit video or just simply don't have the time to figure out how to do that, this is a non-editing video skilled approach. And this actually maps onto an approach we use in our instructional practice anyway as field instructors in student teaching back at UD. So we collaboratively developed this idea called parallel conferencing. And the original intent was around the fact that we had high caseloads of candidates we were trying to serve simultaneously, and they were teaching simultaneously. So sometimes, you know, the puzzle piece didn't work out. You couldn't see some candidates in a given week. So what do? They can't go without getting feedback and debriefing their lessons. So in traditional parallel conferencing during non-COVID life, the candidate would record their lesson, they would self-select a 15-minute clip, and they would fill out an annotation reflection form to self-select stopping points and then write out their internal and visible thinking that justified their decision-making during that particular instructional point. They would then share that with the field instructor, and we would gather together in this image face-to-face around the video, co-view it parallel side by side for 15 minutes, and we would add additional stopping points to debrief and reflect on the value of the decision-making that occurred in that particular lesson segment. So during COVID, it was pretty straightforward. Instead of us meeting together in the same physical space, we did exactly what we're doing here. We did screen sharing, we met on Zoom, and we followed exactly the same protocols. So Rachel's showing the form here. And again, the form is a couple pages long, and you do need to give explicit directions and even model how to complete this form. This is not, every candidate doesn't do this intuitively. Rachel, you can just click through. But if you want additional examples that have been already completed by other students, I can connect you with those examples. If you want to read the article that explains how to use this form and justifies the use of the form, you can do that. And you can contact us and we'll get you the link to that article as well. I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. And I appreciate the shout outs to the research-based practices to tie that back into what we're talking about from the beginning, right? And that there is some evidence here for what we can do.
I have a question actually, Elizabeth, can I ask? So
Sure.
I think this is fantastic. And in my book, I talk about virtual practicum and sort of making that transition. And so I'm curious what challenges beyond the technology that you encountered, maybe one challenge, but also what did you find, did you find any benefits to this approach that were unexpected?
So those are two really good questions. So yes, we had challenges, and yes, there were unexpected benefits. So that's the short answer, and now I'll give you examples for each, which I'm assuming you're interested in. So first, some of the challenges were logistical. The candidates didn't have automatic access to the learning management systems that the schools were using with their pupils, because that required different permission settings. And no one thought about the need for candidates to have access to learning management systems. So they wanted to record themselves in the learning management system interacting with pupils. And that, because of, again, logistic issues, we didn't get to that until the very end of the semester. Now we know that's an issue, and that's going to inform the way in which we communicate around permissions and settings for the fall, obviously. An unexpected benefit was lag time between the debriefing session. So normally, traditionally, we would go out, we would observe a candidate, and we would meet immediately after a lesson, unless it was parallel conferencing. But traditionally, we go out, we meet immediately after a lesson. That can be really difficult for a teacher candidate whose head is still so noisy with everything that just happened in the lesson event, to then sit down and be able to articulate the rationales, the justifications. God forbid there was something that went crazy in the lesson, they might be really emotional. So that lag time between being able to see their practice literally mirrored back to them in a video and be able to write and collect and manage their thought process really helped kind of lighten the cognitive and the emotional load for them because of that space. So it's something that I think as a collective with my colleagues who do field work back at the university, we're going to want to talk about, how do we make use of that space in educative ways, regardless of COVID.
Thank you.
We did have a quick question come in that's related to this before we move on, and that's real quick. Did you find that there's an optimal amount of lag time between the lesson and the debrief?
It's a good question, and I don't have a ready-made answer because this was such a short kind of quick fix moment in time in the semester. I'd much rather wait to try it out for a full semester or even 2 semesters to say that there's an optimal time.
Great.
So, I think, Rachel, you're going to take a first stab at this. What advice do you have about creating an integrated programmatic online experience?
All right. What a great question, Matt. So I am really, really fortunate because I get to work with Bill and Elizabeth and our other colleague, Liz Farley-Ripple. She was unable to come with us today. And Cristala Musa, who's our director at the School of Education and also an integral part of our program in its design. And one of the things that I think, because the program that we created for our graduate program, it was initially created as a fully online program. And when you do that, students have that expectation that everything is going to be online. We actually have in our essay questions, when you're applying to the program, you are required to explain why you want to take an online program, how you're going to manage your time, how you're a self-initiated learner, and how this learning environment is going to work well for you. Okay, so all of that's thrown out the window with what we're experiencing right now if you're not teaching in a program that has these expectations already outlined. So what we're going to do is we're going to share with you some of the things that we have learned just overall. And these are tinkered because, like I said, we work a lot. I do a lot of work with universities, but then also K-12 is sort of ramping up and preparing for the fall. And so a lot of these areas work really, you know, they are important components when thinking about online programmatic instruction for K-12. But what I did was I revised this tool to really think about what we're doing here at the university level. And some of these areas, as individual faculty, you can play a strong role and make your own decisions. But a lot of these are either programmatic decisions, and some of them are even university-wide decisions or school-wide, depending upon the configuration of where you're working. So there are 5 areas that I'm just really briefly going to talk about. I had mentioned, or Matt had mentioned earlier, we created a website, Elizabeth's documents, this document, the planning chart that I have is, all of those things are up on the website, so you don't need to take notes about this, but I just wanted to mention. But there's 5 areas that you would want to consider when you're creating a cohesive program: technology, communication, teacher preparation, instruction. We sort of break this into 2 areas, generally speaking, but then instruction when it comes to accessibility and privacy related issues. And so what you'll find on this document are some key questions to help guide you and what you may want to do, whether it be as an entire program or as an entire school of education, or quite frankly, this would help at any level, not just schools of education, is to kind of look at these questions and evaluate where are we right now and what do we need to be able to build continuity. Because one of the things we have to consider is that we really have to consider the student's perspective and what their life and what they're bringing to the table when you're creating an online environment, as well as the instructor and what the instructor is bringing to the table as well. And by establishing continuity, you can take out the logistical obstacles like, where do I find my work? And instead, students can focus on the actual learning activities that you want to engage them with. And as the instructor, you can really work on ramping up what your instructional design looks like. So for example, one of the suggestions that I always give is that you have to have a single LMS, because think about it, you have students taking 3, 4, 5, 6 classes. If they're going, this happened once when we were just rolling out Canvas years ago. We had some students using Canvas, some instructors using Canvas, we had some instructors using WebCT, some, I don't know, creating their own websites. This gets really confusing for students when they can't identify and have a portal for all of their work. So that's something that we want to think about. Like I said, you can read through these. Communication is really important. Bill tapped into that about community building, but one way you do that is through regular communication. You want to make communication regular and you want to make it reliable. We all do those Monday morning messages. A lot of times we also push out, here's a reminder. I always push out the day before an assignment is due, just a reminder you have work due, because sometimes in an online course, out of sight is out of mind, right? And so if students aren't showing up face-to-face in a class, that they're sort of forgetting that this even exists. I do also want to really highlight teacher preparation, and that especially at the university level, integrating technology tends to be optional and voluntary. Well, first of all, it's not if everything has to go online like it was in the spring, right? We need to use it. In the fall, I know that there's choices that our university is allowing instructors to make, but at the end of the day, I don't see any scenario in which there is no technology. Elizabeth alluded to this, that there is no online instruction. And because of that, and because students are paying tuition, a lot of tuition, to go to our colleges and universities and to be prepared, they deserve faculty who maybe not pedagogical experts when it comes to online instruction, but have a basic set of skills that they are able to say, yes, we've taken courses to really ramp up our own skills. And this has to be something across the board. It can't just be left to who wants to do it and who doesn't want to do it, because if we're all required to teach online, then we need to have a set of skills that we have developed and that we are able to tell our students, yes, we're coming at this. We might not be perfect, we might not be experts, but we have most definitely taken this into consideration. The areas related to instruction are the things that we had, I sort of had mentioned before, but you would want to have continuity when it comes to, for example, expectations for student engagement. In our programs, you know, that doesn't take away, we're not talking about academic freedom or taking away teacher autonomy. We're just talking about, well, you know, as a program, are there certain things that we can expect from all of our students in the School of Education? Like how, you know, that there will be both synchronous, you can expect to see your professor at least once a week, whether it be through a video introduction or lecture or, you know, some other way, something like that, to establish certain levels of norms to provide continuity for students and a routine so that they know that you're there on the other side of the computer. I also would be remiss to remind everyone about the accessibility and privacy issues related to instructional policies and procedures that we must consider. You know, a lot of instructors who shall remain nameless, you know, go to Google Images and click Save As, and they slap it on their Canvas site, or they slap on like a PDF with from an article that they have. That's not that doesn't follow copyright issues, and it's really important that we're modeling for our students, especially since they're teacher education students, about how to legally, you know, use sources, give credit where credit is due, and to also provide accommodations when we need to do so. In two different ways. One way, accommodating technology. You have to consider that different tools look different in different environments. If you have some students using an iPad, that's different than students who will be, you know, using a regular computer. So this is, as I mentioned, posted up on the website. And is there someone else who would like to add to this? No? All right, so I'm gonna, our top 5 lessons, and how about Bill, why don't you take us here?
Okay, well, first of all, one of the things is that we have learned, especially this last spring, was that we do have to consider the whole student experience. I think that one of the issues that students were really upfront with me about, especially undergraduate students, is that they felt that teachers felt that they had so much time on their hands now that they didn't have to commute to campus, or that they didn't have all those other campus activities because of COVID-19. But in many cases, they actually had more on their plate. They had more family responsibilities. They were required to have, they were watching family members, little brothers and sisters. So they actually had a lot more going on, and they were actually more busy during that time. So thinking through the whole student experience, I think, is going to be a really important part of that they have other things than your class, and they have other responsibilities that are outside the academic work that we do really need to be responsive to as teachers.
Okay. Elizabeth, do you have something that you'd like to talk about here?
I think Bill did a great job covering it here. I think one of the things that was hardest for myself and my colleagues who do field instruction is to really do that last bullet point justice, accepting the shift in the teaching context. We spent a lot of times and many meetings really venting about what it's like right now, and how, when are we going to know what's going to go on, and how can we blah, blah, blah. And we really wasted some energy that could have been really focused on, okay, this is what it is, and here's the ways in which we need to function given the current context. So if I could leave anyone with that, there's a time to vent, and then there's a time to accept and build and plan and move on.
Sounds good. I just had to plug in my computer. I apologize. It was just running. So, all right. So why don't we talk about, so here is the link to our website. It'll have the slide deck on there. There's also, for my book, I have a coupon code if you're interested in purchasing it directly through TC Press. And so why don't we now leave time for some questions? Matt, do you want to?
Yeah, we've been handling questions as they came in. There was one that if we wanted to address here, I promised that we would send them an email if we ran out of time. But the question here was, how have you responded, particularly in the field experience, how have you responded to students' school-based mentors and their use of and ability with online teaching?
Elizabeth?
Yeah, can you clarify the question for me again? So what the school-based mentor, can you say that one more time, Matt? I just want to make sure.
Yeah, sure. Let's see if I can, if Peggy's willing, I can hand her the microphone. Peggy, you should have permission. You might need to unmute yourself. No.
Hi, Peggy. Perhaps she stepped away. Why don't you just read it one more
I
time?
promised that we'd follow up with her through email.
Okay, sure.
That was the outstanding question. There was a request for the URL for where these will be posted. Steve, I just tracked it down, so I'm going to paste it in the chat as well so that folks have a chance to find this when this is hot off the presses.
Yes, there will be, I believe they'll have the, right, you'll have the slides and you'll also have the video. And then on our website, we'll have these documents if you're interested in downloading them. So, and you can also contact us all individually. Our email addresses are on the first slide. And we would be more than happy and excited to talk to you.
Thank you, panel. Steve, did you have any closing remarks for us?
Well, yeah, I just want to, on behalf of Reinvention Collaborative, thank all of you for this just amazing resource. And you saw in the chats, people are eager to have access to it, to share it with their colleagues. We encourage everyone to please do so. These are free and meant to, as was said early on, address the need to move from that remote in an emergency mode to a much more thoughtful and intentional research-based approach to online education. We thank these scholars from the University of Delaware's School of Education and also the Teaching Center at UD for your tremendous contribution. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you and bye.